As my heir, William now assumes the Scottish titles which have meant so much to me.
King Charles has signed a midnight emergency order, giving Catherine sole authority over the crown jewels. This high-stakes decree strips control from traditional courtiers and hands the realm's ultimate treasures to the future queen. Why did the king bypass Prince William and Queen Camilla entirely for this lockdown? The race to protect these historic symbols has triggered a brutal palace power struggle. The silent midnight decree at Windsor Castle. The heavy iron gates of Windsor Castle clicked shut as a fleet of black sedans slid onto the gravel courtyard. It was nearly 2 in the morning. No flashbulbs went off. No public announcements flashed on the news wires. The drivers kept the headlights dimmed to avoid drawing the attention of the private security patrols. Inside the main vehicle sat 3 senior constitutional lawyers from the London firm that manages the private estate of the monarch. They carried leather briefcases containing a single, tightly drafted piece of paper. This was not a routine administrative meeting or a scheduling update. It was a midnight constitutional lockdown that had been planned in total secrecy for the past 3 weeks. The lawyers were escorted immediately up the stone staircase to the private library of King Charles. The room was lit by a single desk lamp, casting long shadows across the historic portraits on the walls. The king sat behind a massive mahogany desk, his face showing signs of deep physical fatigue. He did not engage in the usual formal pleasantries. He gestured for the attorneys to lay the document flat on the green leather surface. This specific text was an emergency letters patent, a binding sovereign decree that does not require the prior approval of the British Parliament. Charles reached for his fountain pen, his hand steady as he pressed the nib to the parchment. The moment the ink dried on that signature, the structural foundation of the royal asset system was completely rewritten. The emergency order officially stripped all traditional courtiers and state trustees of their management rights over the legendary crown jewels. In their place, the king granted Catherine, the Princess of Wales, sole and absolute authority over the entire historic collection. This meant that every diamond, ruby, and ceremonial scepter in the royal vaults was now under her direct personal jurisdiction. She was no longer just a senior member of the family. She was the definitive guardian of the ultimate symbols of the realm. The immediate motivation for this drastic move was an intense power struggle brewing within the palace bureaucracy. For centuries, the royal regalia had been managed by a collective board of trustees, including senior politicians, court officials, and the Lord Chamberlain. This traditional system worked perfectly during periods of domestic stability. However, high-level intelligence reports delivered to the king's private secretary in 2026 revealed a growing vulnerability. External financial factions and legal teams were exploring ways to use the immense valuation of the state treasures as leverage during future constitutional transitions. By consolidating the entire collection under a single trusted individual, Charles was effectively building a bulletproof wall around the monarchy's heritage. The choice of Catherine as the sole authority sent a massive shockwave through the senior staff members who were completely excluded from the drafting process. Courtiers at Buckingham Palace did not discover the existence of the decree until the official letters patent were logged into the state archives the following morning. The administrative offices erupted into total chaos as veteran secretaries realized their traditional veto powers had been completely wiped out overnight. They had spent decades managing the logistics of the royal collection, deciding which pieces could be loaned out and which items remained locked in the vaults. Now, a single signature had transferred that entire apparatus to a private office at Kensington Palace. The legal mechanics used to execute this transfer were incredibly precise. The attorneys had utilized an ancient royal prerogative statute that allows the sovereign to assign personal property rights without consulting the Privy Council. This specific legal loop prevented any institutional pushback from traditionalists within the court system. The king had deliberately chosen a path that offered zero opportunity for debate, delay, or internal compromise. He wanted the lockdown to be an absolute fait accompli before the rest of the family could organize any formal objections. The physical reality of this decree meant that the security protocols at the Tower of London had to be altered immediately. Specialized royal protection units received encrypted orders to update their access logs before sunrise. The traditional keepers of the jewel house were informed that no piece of the regalia could be moved, cleaned, or prepared for a public event without a direct written authorization code issued exclusively by Catherine's private office. The keys to the most secure vaults in the country had effectively changed hands while the capital was fast asleep. The sudden shift in authority created an intense undercurrent of tension within the royal households. For generations, the possession and usage of these historic jewels had been treated as the ultimate visual currency of royal power. The pieces were not mere ornaments. They were living symbols of legitimacy and status. By bypassing the traditional channels, Charles was sending a clear, unyielding signal to the entire establishment about who he trusted to secure the future of the House of Windsor. The lines had been drawn in permanent ink, and the first major piece of the institutional puzzle was now locked securely in place. As the lawyers packed their documents back into their secure briefcases, the king stood up and walked toward the large window overlooking the dark castle grounds. He knew that this midnight decree would trigger a series of intense personal confrontations within his own home before the week was over. He had deliberately chosen to act in the dark to protect the long-term stability of the crown he wore. The vehicle slipped away from the castle gates just as the first light of dawn began to break over the river, leaving behind a completely rewritten royal reality that the rest of the court would soon have to face. Why Prince William was left out of the legal loop. The midday sun beat down on the private gardens of Kensington Palace as Prince William walked into his personal office. A secure digital terminal sat on his desk, blinking with a high-priority notification from the State Archives in London. When he opened the file, his expression changed instantly. Laid out in crisp legal terminology was the emergency letters patent signed by King Charles at Windsor Castle just hours earlier. William stared at the document, his eyes focusing directly on the final clause that granted Catherine sole authority over the entire historic collection. The heir to the throne had not received a single phone call, briefing memo, or private warning about this massive shift in constitutional power. He had been left completely out of the legal loop. The decision to bypass the direct successor to the throne was a deliberate, highly calculated move by the king's senior advisors. In traditional royal protocol, any major alteration to the management of state assets is discussed thoroughly within the inner family council. William was not just a son. He was the future sovereign who would eventually inherit the very treasures being locked down. Being blindsided by his own father's decree created an immediate undercurrent of tension within the private apartments. William called for his private secretary, demanding a complete breakdown of the legal mechanisms used to finalize the order without his signature. The core reason for this strategic exclusion lay out within the complex structure of the British constitutional framework. The King's legal team in 2026 realized that vesting this specific authority in the direct line of succession would create a massive conflict of interest. If William held sole control over the regalia, the assets would be legally tied to his future role as king, making them vulnerable to specific parliamentary tax laws and institutional audits during the eventual transition of power. By placing the absolute authority exclusively in the hands of the future queen consort, the lawyers had created a brilliant legal buffer. Catherine's office operated under a completely different statutory classification, effectively shielding the crown jewels from bureaucratic interference. The strategic layout of the decree also served a profound psychological purpose within the family dynamic. King Charles was acutely aware that William's current focus was entirely divided between his extensive state duties, his public patronages, and the intense emotional pressure of supporting his family through recent health battles. The king wanted to alleviate the administrative burden on his son while empowering his daughter-in-law to act as the ultimate institutional anchor. Catherine had demonstrated an unmatched level of discipline, public trust, and absolute discretion over the past decade. By making her the definitive guardian of the realm's symbols, Charles was publicly signaling his complete confidence in her ability to protect the monarchy's heritage. The realization of the true motive behind the decree did not immediately ease the tension inside the palace walls. A private confrontation reportedly took place in the private apartments later that afternoon, when William discussed the filing with Catherine. He wanted to know exactly when she had been briefed on the project, and why she had chosen to maintain absolute silence during their recent family dinners. Catherine explained calmly that she had been bound by a strict, legally binding royal non-disclosure protocol dictated by the king's personal attorneys. She had not kept the secret out of a lack of trust, but out of absolute obedience to a sovereign command designed to protect the long-term stability of the House of Windsor. The conversation shifted the balance of power within the Kensington Palace infrastructure. For years, William had handled the primary strategic decisions for their joint household, managing the public relations output and the long-term planning for their future roles. Now, Catherine held an independent, state-sanctioned power that completely bypassed his jurisdiction. Her private office was suddenly elevated to a position of immense institutional leverage, possessing the sole authority to dictate the terms of usage for the world's most famous jewel collection. The administrative teams had to adjust their workflows immediately, routing all future ceremonial requests through a newly established secure clearinghouse managed exclusively by the princess's staff. Senior courtiers at Buckingham Palace watched the unfolding dynamic with extreme caution. They realized that the king had successfully created a dual custody system for the future of the monarchy. While William would hold the political and constitutional power of the sovereign, Catherine would hold the absolute custody of the visual symbols that legitimized that power. It was a masterclass in institutional design, ensuring that no single individual could alter the heritage of the crown without the explicit cooperation of the other. The legal loop had been closed with absolute precision, and the future king was left with no choice but to accept the new reality that had been written into the state archives. As the afternoon faded into evening, William returned to his terminal to formally log his acknowledgement of the emergency order. The initial shock of being excluded had transitioned into a quiet appreciation for the strategic brilliance of his father's final move. He looked out the window at the bustling capital city, realizing that the survival of their dynasty required unorthodox, high-stakes decisions in the dead of night. The gears of the state had turned, the new guardian had been officially appointed, and the family would now have to present a totally unified front as the rest of the court scrambled to react to the news. The secret vaults of the Tower of London. A heavy steel door inside the Wakefield Tower slowly groaned open as a team of engineers cut the electronic seal. The humid night air of London did not penetrate this deep into the subterranean complex. The temperature inside the secure jewel house was strictly maintained at a constant 62 degrees Fahrenheit to preserve the historic materials. Pacing down the narrow stone corridor was the Princess of Wales, flanked by 4 senior officers from the Royal Logistic Corps. They did not wear ceremonial uniforms. They carried digital scanning tablets, high-resolution magnifying lenses, and laser-guided valuation scales. This unannounced audit was the very first operational deployment of the absolute power granted by the emergency decree. The immediate objective of the midnight inspection was a complete, piece-by-piece inventory of the entire historic collection. For decades, the public believed that the state regalia remained completely static inside the reinforced display cases, viewed by millions of tourists annually under heavy glass. The reality hidden behind the scenes was far more complex. The archive contained thousands of individual loose diamonds, historic family tiaras, and ceremonial scepters that had not been publicly displayed since the coronation in 1953. The traditional keepers of the jewel house stood by in total silence, watching the new guardian systematically take control of the country's most valuable material heritage. The engineers began by moving the primary display units into the secure testing room, located directly behind the main gallery. The first item placed on the scanning table was the Imperial State Crown, a piece featuring nearly 3,000 individual diamonds, including the historic Cullinan II. Catherine adjusted a specialized headlamp, leaning closer to inspect the platinum settings under a high-powered lens. This was not a symbolic gesture for the cameras. The princess was executing a rigorous forensic verification process to ensure that every single stone matched the original structural blueprints logged by the royal jewelers in 2026. The audit quickly uncovered a significant security vulnerability within the traditional storage protocols. As the technical team cross-referenced the physical inventory with the digital tracking system used by the traditional board of trustees, they discovered a major discrepancy. Several highly valuable loose gemstones, originally inherited from the private collection of Queen Victoria, had been logged under an outdated administrative classification. This loophole effectively allowed certain senior court officials to move the pieces between various palace workshops for cleaning and resetting without securing a direct, sovereign signature. It was exactly the kind of institutional blind spot that external legal teams could have exploited during a future constitutional transition. Catherine's reaction to the discovery was immediate and decisive. She instructed the military logistics team to log the vulnerable items under a newly created, highly restricted security tier. The technical staff updated the system protocols in real time, implementing a dual-factor biometric authorization process. From that exact moment, the vault doors could not be unlocked, and the display cases could not be opened without a dynamic security key generated exclusively by the private office at Kensington Palace. The traditional keepers were stripped of their master keys, forcing them to operate under the absolute oversight of the new Guardian's staff. The sudden lockdown triggered an immediate internal alarm that rippled through the security headquarters of the capital. High-level officers within the Metropolitan Police Service noticed the sudden, unscheduled protocol updates flashing on their monitoring screens. They scrambled to contact the tower's governor, assuming a sophisticated cyber attack or a physical breach was taking place inside the jewel house. The governor had to personally intervene, explaining through an encrypted phone line that the operation was a state-sanctioned inspection authorized by the highest tier of the monarchy. The panic subsided, but the message across the security apparatus was clear. The management of the realm's ultimate treasures had changed forever. The inspection of the vaults continued into the early hours of the morning, moving into the deep storage rooms where the private estate collections were held. The team examined the historic gold plates, the ceremonial swords of state, and the delicate coronation rings worn by centuries of monarchs. Each item was subjected to a detailed laser scan, creating a permanent, unalterable digital twin that was automatically uploaded to a secure server network managed by the state archives. The process was designed to eliminate any possibility of future documentation, fraud, or unauthorized modifications by external workshops. The strategic layout of the audit served as a powerful, non-verbal warning to various factions attempting to exert influence over the royal asset system. For months, rumors had circulated within the financial districts of the city that certain bureaucratic committees were looking to evaluate the commercial potential of the royal collection for national tourism initiatives. By asserting her absolute state-sanctioned custody over the physical objects, Catherine was completely slamming that door shut. She was demonstrating that the crown jewels were not commercial assets to be analyzed by corporate boards. They were the sacred, untouchable property of the sovereign, protected by a modern framework of military precision. As the final data entries were verified, the logistics team began returning the primary ceremonial pieces to their respective display cases behind the reinforced glass. The princess stood in the center of the dark gallery, looking at the glittering display that had symbolized the authority of the British state for generations. She had successfully completed the first phase of the constitutional defense, closing the institutional loopholes and securing the physical perimeter of the vault. The vehicles waiting in the courtyard of the fortress started their engines as the morning mist began to rise off the River Thames, carrying the new guardian back to her residence with the absolute assurance that the ultimate symbols of the realm were now completely under her lock and key. Queen Camilla's Furious Palace Ultimatum. A set of priceless porcelain teacups rattled violently against a heavy silver tray inside the private sitting room at Clarence House. Queen Camilla stood pacing before the large bay windows, her heels clicking sharply against the polished wood floor as she processed the absolute disaster that had unfolded hours earlier. In her hand, she tightly gripped a printed copy of the morning state archive logs, her eyes scanning the cold legal phrasing over and over again. Across the room sat King Charles, staring silently into the roaring fireplace with an expression of deep, administrative exhaustion. The news of the Midnight Letters patent had finally reached her desk, and the internal institutional fallout was immediate. For the past 2 years, Camilla had carefully managed the scheduling, styling, and public presentation of the royal family's image, deciding exactly which historic pieces from Queen Elizabeth's private collection would be worn at high-profile state dinners. Now, with a single unannounced stroke of a pen, her signature on those request forms had been rendered entirely useless. The confrontation that erupted behind closed doors that morning was the most intense internal rift the palace had seen since the coronation. Camilla did not argue about the commercial valuation of the diamonds or the specific technical logistics of the security protocols at the Tower of London. Her fury was anchored entirely to the profound symbolic insult this decree represented to her position. In the traditional hierarchy of the British court, the Queen Consort holds the ultimate, unquestioned veto power over the styling and presentation of the family's public appearances. By granting Catherine sole and absolute authority over the entire historic collection, Charles had effectively stripped his own wife of her highest traditional privilege. He had demoted her to a secondary position within her own court, forcing her to seek written permission from her daughter-in-law simply to access the royal vaults. The specific catalyst for the argument was an upcoming state banquet planned for late autumn in 2026. Camilla had already instructed the royal jewelers to prepare the historic Vladimir tiara, a piece deeply associated with the late monarch's personal style, for her own use during the diplomatic reception. However, when her staff submitted the standard logistics request to the jewel house that morning, the terminal rejected the entry. A formal notification informed them that the item had been placed under a restricted security tier by the private office at Kensington Palace. The Queen Consort was told that she would need to submit a formal written application detailing the exact duration of the loan, the specific event parameters, and the specialized security transport measures provided before the piece could be released. The ultimatum Camilla delivered to her husband shook the private apartments to their core. She made it absolutely clear that she would refuse to participate in the upcoming state banquet or stand alongside the king during future joint parliamentary openings if the emergency order was not immediately amended. She demanded the creation of a co-custody framework that would grant her equal veto power over the historic pieces. To enforce her demand, she issued a stark warning regarding the fragile stability of the current reign. If Charles allowed this public demotion to stand, she would authorize her personal office to withdraw from all joint public appearances for the remainder of the year, leaving the king to navigate a highly volatile political landscape entirely on his own. The internal crisis forced senior courtiers at Buckingham Palace into an immediate damage control meeting that dragged on for hours. They realized that a public strike by the Queen Consort would create a massive international media disaster that would completely dominate news cycles and overshadow the government's diplomatic initiatives. The press would instantly pick up on the visual absence of Camilla at state events, leading to widespread speculation about a total systemic collapse within the inner family circle. Yet, the legal advisors warned that reversing the letter's patent was completely impossible. The emergency order had already been formally logged into the state archives, and changing it now would signal immense institutional weakness, proving that a sovereign decree could be overturned by internal family pressure. The debate then shifted toward the historic ownership of the late Queen's personal jewelry collection, an archive that had traditionally remained separate from the official state regalia. Camilla argued that even if Catherine held the rights to the ceremonial crowns and scepters, the private family heirlooms should remain under the direct control of the king's wife. But the legal reality was unyielding. The attorneys had drafted the emergency order with such sweeping precision that it encompassed every single item currently held within the secure vaults of the royal estate, making zero distinction between state property and private heritage. Catherine's private office held the master key to everything, leaving the Queen Consort completely locked out of the family's material history. As the argument reached its peak, Charles stood up from his chair, refusing to yield to the intense personal pressure. He explained that the decision was not a personal slight against her character or her role as his queen. It was a cold, clinical institutional defense designed to protect the monarchy from a growing wave of external legal vulnerabilities. The king knew that the long-term survival of the House of Windsor required the absolute consolidation of its ultimate symbols under a single, highly stable anchor who would command the public trust for the next 4 decades. Catherine represented that future stability, and the decision to empower her office was an unalterable act of statecraft that could not be compromised for the sake of domestic comfort. The room fell into an icy silence as the realization of her total institutional defeat settled over the space. Camilla looked at the printed archive log on the table, seeing the bold signatures of the constitutional lawyers staring back at her in black and white. She realized that any further resistance would only expose the internal fractures of the court to the public eye, playing directly into the hands of those who wished to see the institution fail. The traditional balance of power within the court had shifted permanently, and the modern framework of the monarchy had chosen its ultimate guardian, She turned away from the window, her expression hardening as she realized she would have to adapt to a completely rewritten royal reality, where the keys to the kingdom were no longer in her hands. The hidden health strategy behind the sovereign order. A quiet hum from a secure, encrypted laser printer broke the dead silence inside the central administrative offices of the Privy Council in London. A senior legal advisor stepped forward, pulled a 5-page document from the output tray, and immediately placed it inside a reinforced red dispatch box. This box was reserved exclusively for top-tier state intelligence and constitutional matters. The text inside was an exhaustive line-by-line cross-reference of the newly signed letters patent against the emergency provisions of the Regency Act. It laid bare the true, hidden health strategy that had driven King Charles to sign the historic decree in the middle of the night at Windsor Castle. This was not an impulsive family gesture or a simple display of personal affection for his daughter-in-law. It was a calculated, high-stakes institutional barrier designed to protect the ultimate treasures of the British state from an impending constitutional crisis. The confidential document outlined a stark, clinical reality that the palace inner circle had spent months trying to keep hidden from the international media. The king's personal medical team had recently issued an updated, highly classified assessment regarding his long-term treatment itinerary. The data forced the monarch to face the practical legal implications of a potential temporary regency or an unexpected transition phase. Under standard British constitutional law, if a sitting monarch becomes physically incapacitated or undergoes a prolonged medical procedure that prevents them from executing their state duties, a designated regent is appointed to take full operational control of the sovereign office. However, the legal definition of what constitutes personal sovereign property versus state-administered property within a sudden regency framework remains incredibly fluid and dangerously ambiguous. The king's personal attorneys had discovered a massive, systemic vulnerability within this legal framework. They realized that a sudden, uncoordinated shift in executive power would automatically expose the entire collection of the crown jewels to intense bureaucratic interference, unexpected state inheritance taxes, and aggressive parliamentary asset valuations. If a regency council was triggered, while the historic regalia remained under the traditional board of trustees, various government committees would have the statutory right to freeze the assets, launch public financial audits, or alter the traditional usage protocols under the guise of national security. For a monarchy that relies entirely on the absolute sanctity and independence of its visual symbols, the prospect of politicians or treasury officials dictating the terms of the royal collection was an existential nightmare. To prevent this massive bureaucratic intrusion, the legal team designed a masterclass in long-term institutional survival. By transferring the absolute custody and sole authority of the entire historic collection to Catherine before any formal health transition occurred, they effectively decoupled the physical symbols of the realm from the political mechanics of the sovereign office. The Princess of Wales held this new authority under an independent, private statutory classification that could not be suspended, audited, or dissolved by a change in the king's physical status or the activation of a regency council. The assets were safely locked away in a legal fortress, completely beyond the reach of parliamentary interference or external legal challenges. Even if the king was temporarily sidelined by his medical treatment, the ultimate symbols of the monarchy's legitimacy remained entirely untouchable, anchored by a trusted individual who operated completely outside the jurisdiction of Whitehall. The strategic move provided immense relief to a quiet group of constitutional scholars and senior state officials who had been monitoring the family's structural vulnerabilities behind closed doors. They recognized that securing Catherine's sole authority ensured absolute institutional continuity at a time when the inner family circle was facing unprecedented personal and physical strain. While King Charles focused entirely on his medical recovery and Prince William balanced his mounting state responsibilities and public patronages, the future queen consort would stand as the unyielding guardian of the monarchy's physical legitimacy. The legal loop had been engineered with such clinical precision that it guaranteed the physical safety of the treasures for the next 4 decades, proving that the ancient House of Windsor was fully prepared to alter its traditional rules to guarantee its survival in the modern era. The long-term planning behind the decree also took into account the highly volatile media landscape in 2026. The palace was fully aware that anti-monarchy factions and international financial analysts were regularly calling for a complete public inventory and commercial valuation of the royal family's private estates. By placing the crown jewels under the strict, personal jurisdiction of Catherine's private office at Kensington Palace, the king had successfully created a permanent shield against public disclosure. Under current legislation, the personal property records and private administrative decisions of the Princess of Wales are entirely exempt from Freedom of Information requests, ensuring that the specific security logs, valuation data, and storage locations of the state treasures would remain permanently confidential. The hidden health strategy also solved a pressing logistical problem regarding the physical presentation of the family during upcoming international summits. The king knew that if his health forced him to scale back his public appearances, the future queen consort would need to command absolute visual authority whenever she represented the British state on the global stage. By granting her sole control over the regalia, Charles was giving her the unilateral right to deploy the most historic, powerful pieces of the collection for her own public engagements, without having to clear the decisions through traditional court committees or face internal vetoes from Clarence House. It was a total consolidation of visual power, designed to project an image of absolute strength, stability, and continuity to foreign leaders and global audiences alike. As the senior legal advisor closed the red dispatch box and prepared to deliver the final assessment to the Privy Council leaders, the true genius of the King's Midnight Maneuver became clear. Charles had used his sovereign prerogative to outmaneuver the entire state apparatus, protecting his family's heritage from the very system he served. The emergency letters patent were no longer just a piece of paper. They were a definitive insurance policy for the future of the crown. The battle lines against bureaucratic overreach had been drawn in permanent ink. The legal defenses were fully activated, and the ultimate symbols of the British realm were now completely secure under the watchful eye of their new institutional guardian. The new guardian of the British realm. The heavy soundproof doors of the grand ballroom at Buckingham Palace were thrown open by two liveried footmen. A brilliant flash of light erupted from the press enclosure as international news correspondents raised their cameras. It was the evening of the annual diplomatic reception, the first major state event since King Charles signed the Midnight Letters patent at Windsor Castle. The global media had spent weeks speculating about the intense internal fallout, the furious arguments at Clarence House, and the changing balance of power within the court. Now, the moment of physical reality had arrived. Pacing slowly down the center carpet, moving completely ahead of the senior court officials, was Catherine, the Princess of Wales. The crowd of foreign dignitaries went entirely silent as the visual impact of her appearance registered across the room. Pinned securely to the shoulder of her formal evening gown was the historic Cambridge Lover's Knot tiara, paired with an unreleased ceremonial diamond necklace that had remained locked inside the deepest subterranean vaults of the Tower of London since 1953. This was not a standard choice of jewelry selected by a wardrobe assistant. It was a massive, non-verbal declaration of absolute institutional power. By displaying a restricted piece that had traditionally required a full sovereign signature to release, the princess was letting the world know that the emergency decree was fully operational. She was appearing not just as the wife of the heir, but as the definitive guardian of the realm's ultimate treasures. The international reaction to the broadcast was immediate and overwhelming. Within minutes, constitutional scholars and media analysts across London were pulling up live feeds to dissect the visual symbolism of the event. The message sent to both external critics and internal family factions was completely unyielding. The future queen consort held absolute custody of the visual currency that legitimized the authority of the British state. The traditional board of trustees and senior politicians who had spent months attempting to find a structural loophole to audit the collection were left completely powerless. Catherine's private office at Kensington Palace had successfully established a permanent, bulletproof wall around the monarchy's physical heritage. The long-term operations of the royal asset system were now completely locked down under the new security protocols. Behind the scenes, specialized logistics teams from the Royal Logistic Corps had finished updating the biometric access terminals at the state vaults. Every single historic gemstone, ceremonial scepter, and private family heirloom was now catalogued under an unalterable digital twin system. No piece of the historic regalia could be moved, cleaned, or prepared for a public appearance without a dynamic authorization code issued exclusively by the princess's personal staff. The traditional keepers of the jewel house had been stripped of their independent jurisdiction, leaving the entire apparatus under the direct, clinical control of a single individual who commanded the complete public trust. The strategic layout of this new court hierarchy had effectively outmaneuvered every institutional vulnerability. While Prince William prepared to navigate the immense political and constitutional responsibilities of his future reign, his wife stood as the permanent anchor protecting the material continuity of the dynasty. Even Queen Camilla's furious ultimatums had failed to alter the unyielding precision of the king's health strategy. The ancient House of Windsor had demonstrated its matching ability to rewrite its own centuries-old rules in the dead of night, to guarantee its survival in the modern era. The fortress of privacy was completely secure, the legal loop was closed, and the ultimate symbols of the British realm were now safely held under the lock and key of their new guardian. The gears of the British state have turned an absolute secret, positioning Catherine as the ultimate protector of the monarchy's most sacred treasures. King Charles's midnight emergency order has fundamentally rewritten the rules of court hierarchy, leaving the rest of the family scrambling to adapt to this new reality.